Hello, and welcome to episode 195 of the Book Binge for something a little bit more spooky. Returning, finally, once again to Stephen King with Night Shift. After I reread Rage and The Long Walk under his alter ego or his other pseudonym, Richard Bachman, I decided that Night Shift was going to be my next Stephen King book. I should have been read a little bit earlier, but either way, it was going to make my first Stephen King read in over 2 years. That wasn't a reread because both Rage and The Long Walk were, as I mentioned, rereads. So this is my first time reading a Stephen King book for the first time in over 2 years now, which actually kind of really sucks saying that. I find that to be really unfortunate. I meant for King to be a little bit more of a regular staple on the channel, which obviously did not happen. But that's just kind of the way that things go sometimes. Either way, I am definitely excited to return and be back again with Stephen King. Night Shift might be a short story collection, but I have a lot of good things to say about this one. So let's just jump right into the review with the good, as I always do. Returning to King's horror phase was an absolute blast. His foreword to this book, I believe it was his foreword because I think the introduction was done by somebody else, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, the introduction was not good in this book by John D. MacDonald, not a good introduction. But Stephen King's foreword of this thing was actually quite good. I will say it's going to be a weird thing to specify about, but it seemed like, in my experience, but it seemed like it was like a little bit of a precursor maybe to Dance Macabre, which is kind of his like memoir-esque type of thing, talking about the horror genre and some of his influences. I've had people tell me that I should read Dance Macabre, and if it's anything like the forward of this thing was, I think I now have a reason to read Dance Macabre, whereas I was pretty certain that I was not going to read that book before. So that's something that's fun to note. But basically, I went into this hoping for around half of the stories to be great, and then another quarter of them to be good, and then the last quarter to be whatever quality they happened to be. Fortunately enough for me, the majority of these stories, 12 out of the 20 of them, were in the 4 to 5 star range for my personal tastes. Let's talk about each of said 12 stories a little bit more individually. Keep in mind, these comments come largely from my Goodreads review of the collection. You can check that out if you want a little bit more specifics. I believe that was around 2,100 words in total, so definitely check that out if you want more specific opinions. Otherwise, I'm largely just going to be reading from my thoughts on these individual stories because it's basically the easiest way to cover everything in a timely manner, and also because a couple of these stories I don't quite remember just based off of the title well enough off the top of my head for it to make any sense to do it that way. So let's just talk about, like I said, the books that I loved. First off, we're going to start off, and these are going to fall into a slight baseball analogy, we'll say, because of Stephen King's proclivity towards baseball, but also because I think it made sense. I'm going to separate all 20 of these stories between different categories of the home runs. So the stories that I really loved, the hits, the books that I thought were, or the stories that I thought were good, the foul balls, the stories that I thought had some good ideas but didn't like fully make it, that didn't have an X factor or something that really pushed them over the edge for me. The misses, so the ones that I just completely swung and missed at, or the ones that King rather swung at and missed with. And that's how we're kind of gonna go along with these. Let's start off with the home run stories. I'm gonna list out the ones that I really loved in this regard. The Boogeyman, Sometimes They Come Back, The Ledge, I Know What You Need, The Last Rung on the Ladder, and One for the Road. So the Boogeyman was the first story that really made me jump out of my chair, figuratively speaking, though not necessarily out of fright. Instead, it was the first story in the collection that I felt like I loved fully, even though a few of the previous stories were also pretty good. More on those in the next section. It was visceral, it was dramatic, it had a great twist perfectly executed and which I wasn't anticipating, and it truly haunts the dreams of a potential future version of me. The Boogeyman is one that I actually cheated and rated 6 out of 5 stars because it really worked for me. One that a couple friends were surprised worked as well. Sometimes They Come Back started a minor trend of a handful of these stories which features a climax/resolution, which I wasn't fully on board with overall, but whose pre-climax material was incredible. The thematic balance between the typical bullying ideas, trauma, and the at first subtle paranormal aspects was absolutely brilliant. The climax is a little bit much, but the 30 pages felt like a whole novel in their own right, and 25 of those pages are better than perfect. So even though I didn't love the last 5 stories of Sometimes They Come Back, or the last 5 pages, the first 25 pages of it were immaculate, basically. The Ledge is a little bit of a different story, fear of heights rather than fear of the unknown, for example, and as such, its placement in the collection feels a little bit less natural in my mind, but even so, it's still a phenomenal story. I can't say anything more than I already have without potentially ruining the story, but just know that the hype is decently justified. Mortifying read in all of the best ways. I Know What You Need is very similar to Sometimes They Come Back in that I loved everything before the last few pages. This climax was out there in a bit of a different way, but the creep factor, pun intended, involved through the telling of the story is done so well. Things mount up in a great way, and King did, I think, his only female protagonist in this collection here, but to great effect. I could see this one being an absolutely amazing short film. In fact, I was imagining it in my head the entire time I was reading it as if it was a short film. The Last Drawing on the Ladder is easily the most haunting story in the collection, the most haunting, the most heartbreaking, and the most depressing. The first few pages are a little confusing as you're trying to figure out what's going on, but the middle section is one of the most beautiful sibling relationship stories ever, and the end just ripped all of it away in the absolutely most devastating way possible. I almost want to sue Stephen King for damages to my soul. This story will likely haunt me forever and is probably my favorite story of the whole collection. One for the Road is the absolute perfect conclusion to the collection. That wasn't actually the conclusion. We'll talk about that later. The stories are collected in published order, which is cool, fine, and dandy, but to really round everything out and close after Jerusalem's Lot opens the collection was a massive missed opportunity, because Jerusalem's Lot and One for the Road obviously are both related to and connected to Salem's Lot, the novel. Even so, this story is phenomenal. It perfectly epilogues Salem's Lot in all of the right ways, and without being what I was worried it would be, which was just going to be something that we also get a little bit in one of the Dark Tower books. The horror is creepy just the same way it was in the full novel. The specific conceit is horrific in all of the "that sounds like my worst nightmare" kind of ways, and the atmosphere and narration of the story is brilliant. But speaking of Jerusalem's Lot, let's talk now about the hits of the collection, so the other stories that I thought were great but not quite like favorites type of territory. The hits were Jerusalem's Lot, Graveyard Shift, The Mangler, Gray Matter, Strawberry Spring, and Quitters, Inc. First off, Jerusalem's Lot was more than just a simple prequel to Salem's Lot. It is an epistolary tale uncovering some potential mysteries of the general area in which it is set. King does not often get praise for his prose, but I thought his attention to detail with this one was really great, and I really appreciated it. Even up to and including some really old letters hidden within the story that feature, every single noun of those letters being capitalized, something we have not done in English for a long time. It's something that you actually find in the German language, where every noun is capitalized. Like I said, it's been quite a while since English has utilized every noun being capitalized, but the fact that some of the letters, the oldest letters in the story, having that attention to detail, again, was great. Anyway, great introduction to the collection, even if it was a little bit long. Graveyard Shift is a somewhat predictable tale, especially the climax of it, but I just found the ride of the telling totally worth it. There weren't any crazy twists or turns or unexpected moments, but I really liked it overall. The Mangler is an underrated story, in my opinion, one that I think people largely tend to give a good bit of grief. I'm not going to say I don't understand why, because I do, and because it's kind of obvious. The Mangler is simply a very silly, over-the-top horror extravaganza, but I personally loved it for that. Some of the demon-related stuff felt a little bit weird to me as the story continued towards the end, but even that I totally enjoyed for what it is. Gray Matter is one that I should like less than I do, but think of weirdly fondly. It's super weird, but the tone and narration over the opening is addictive. There's not necessarily a ton going for it, but I thought it was good, though it didn't exactly execute on what I think I wanted it to, or maybe it did. I don't know, it's kind of hard to tell with this one. It's, like I said, it's one I should like less, but regardless. Strawberry Spring is almost in a similar boat as Gray Matter actually, but also not quite. It's a simple story told in a, for King, interesting and different way. The conclusions drawn before the reveal at the end are pretty obvious and predictable, and the story itself is relatively low stakes, but the premise is good and the quality satisfies on the promise it makes. Quitters Inc. is one that I feel like should maybe be in the home run category, so, the favorites, but something that I can't properly identify holds it back just a little bit for me. The conceit is great, and the story that follows is simply splendid. King was quite addicted to a number of substances during his early writing career, and this story felt like a natural byproduct of that, some part of his psyche trying to convince himself to stop. I can't help but wonder if he used this story as part of some subverted influence or inspiration while he was in recovery, but for that, the story is real in a way most of these stories aren't. But man, do you have any idea how illegal everything in the story is? Maybe that's what holds it back for me. It just felt a little bit unrealistic as far as that was concerned, but that's kind of how things go sometimes. But now we are done basically covering the good. Like I said, that was the first 12 of the 20 stories in the collection. So let's talk about the bad of Night Shift, which covers basically the last 8 stories with a caveat. We'll cover that in a little bit. Not everything in the story was a hit. There were a few stories that I liked, but also had some issues with. These are the foul balls, like I mentioned. And then there are some misses beyond that I just straight up did not like at all. So let's talk about those stories. The fouls are Night Surf, Children of the Corn, and The Man Who Loved Flowers. Night Surf felt in many ways like a sort of precursor to The Stand for me conceptually, but had some things that bothered me about it. The characters were horribly unlikable, which doesn't work for a short story like this when you might be expected to care for them to some degree, for it to really have any impact. The ideas on display and what's actually going on don't always do the best at engaging the reader either, so I felt mostly bored and bothered by the characters. I mostly just give it props for what I feel like I should have liked, which was, the kind of Stand precursor concept, or what I feel like might be that, because I haven't read The Stand yet. Children of the Corn is a very prolific tale, and one that is ironically too short. Rather than the 30 pages we got for it, I almost feel like it should have been like 50 to 60 pages, even longer than Jerusalem's Lot, which is the longest story in the collection. The ideas in Children of the Corn are cool, and the intriguing disquiet of everything is also cool, but they don't live up to their potential on account of just being cut short, because there are just too many ideas going on here at once. Also, the petty man who refuses to admit he's wrong because he's just petty isn't necessarily a trope that I love, and it's basically the entire reason this story exists, so conceptually it's hard for me to abide. The Man Who Loved Flowers is actually a quite good story, it just simply rubbed me the wrong way. The first 2/3 of it were adorable, and then the abrupt change, the twist in the story caught me really off guard and frankly kind of upset me. I can't deny it was done well, but as I said before, it definitely just rubbed me the wrong way. So this is one that should be in the hit section, but it just rubbed me all sorts of the wrong way. But for the misses, let's talk about the actual misses, the stories that I just did not like. I Am the Doorway, Battleground, Trucks, and The Woman in the Room. I Am the Doorway is frankly the most bored I have ever been reading Stephen King. I guess a couple of the ideas are sort of interesting, but King does borderline nothing with those ideas, and I would say this could have been a cool concept for a novel, but I'd hate to see a novel as boring as this short story was. Battleground was okay. I didn't outright hate this one. In fact, the concept of it, which is basically just Toy Story, except the toys are terrorists, as I lovingly put it in my description after reading the story, it's a fun, interesting concept. The story kind of is too. It is kind of fun. It's just really strange, not super memorable beyond the title being good at conjuring up the memories of the Toy Story, except they're terrorists type thing. Trucks is also not a horrible story. I also don't outright hate this one either. It's just a bit much is all. The idea is good and the execution is pretty good too, but it's overall not exactly for me. I could see this being a favorite in an alternate universe, perhaps, is kind of the way that I thought about it. And The Woman in the Room was a very bummer way to close the collection after One for the Road was so blatantly perfect for that task. The subject matter is also kind of a bummer in a way I should have appreciated but didn't, and thus the end that should have been its own kind of heartbreak just kind of fell flat for me. But wait a minute, you'll notice something. Let's move on into the ugly. Astute viewers watching this video might realize that I only covered 19 of the 20 stories there, and that I've avoided one up to this point. Let's talk about the please wipe this from my memory category, The Lawnmower Man. Why does this story even exist? It's a waste of paper, it's a waste of brain space, it's a waste of my memory, and I want my time back. Theoretically, I could add that, in fairness, a tiny aspect of the story isn't actually a bad idea, but the execution of it is so bad that I retroactively decided that King should have never entertained it. This story is awful. It's quite frankly, the worst thing that I've ever read. The Lawnmower Man is such a bad story. I just wish, I wish I never wasted my time with it, quite frankly. That is how bad it is. For the recommendation, however, for the whole short story collection, the 20 of them as a whole, there's actually a surprisingly small amount of them that I would say I didn't really like, and even those ones had redeeming qualities, as you'll probably be able to tell by what I just talked about them. All in all, very great collection. I had an absolute blast. 15 of these stories had more good than bad in them to some degree, so that would be the home runs, the hits, and the fouls. Even 2 of the 4 misses of the stories, like I said, had something memorable to sort of redeem them, even if they're not quite my cup of tea. So that left like 3 of the 20 stories that were just absolute flops and that I do not like in any regard. In other words, I absolutely recommend this collection and think there's a lot of good here. I also know that there are plenty of people who think that King is much better as a short story writer than as a novel writer. I have a couple friends who don't like any of King's books, but largely like his short story collections. So, even if you're not somebody who has historically clicked with King a lot, this might be a good place to try again because of the short fiction having a largely better reception. But that is the end of this review and this video. Thank you guys for watching. Next week is something I'm pretty excited about. I'm going to be doing a Witchy Eye review and then doing a collab with DJ Butler right after that. So that is something that should be pretty interesting. Like I said, thank you for watching. I'll be back in those next videos. I hope to see you there.